I also want to get started by thanking Jessica Bennett. There she is, in the back, just walking in. She is the Director of Programs here at the Trevor Zoo. And she's been working with us really since last October, pulling this evening together. So we're actually honored to be able to come here, I think, and in this space. And you'll hear much more about this space and how we've arrived at it. But there's just so much history that we're sitting in right now. So Millbrook School, to me, as I learned things about it, is just such a dynamic little microcosm of a community and a world culture that reaches globally. And the more I learn about Millbrook School, the more fascinating it becomes, I think. There's so many corners to it. Just quoting from something that was put out by the school for the 75th anniversary, it was founded in 1931 in the teeth of the Depression. The Millbrook School for Boys was a tiny school led by a larger-than-life educator whose vision was as unique as it was absolute. Edward Pulling laid a foundation so strong and so right that now, 87 years later, his vision still drives the growth and evolution of the school, yet its very soul remains the same. And at the core of that soul is community service. Since 1931, every student is required to contribute to a service that directly impacts the functioning of the campus community. From caring for the animals in the zoo, to growing food that they use in the dining hall, to technology-based sustainability, to peer counseling. Students are involved here, so every aspect the students are involved in. And this is why we as the Millbrook Historical Society have come here to visit today. Because Millbrook School has an adorable history, I think. There are so many facets to it, but as historians, what we want to remember is that this land was occupied long before Millbrook School arrived here. And so that's why tonight we're starting with a guest speaker, who I'm very pleased to welcome. He grew up in Millbrook, and both of his parents work on campus, and John as well has worked summer jobs on campus. And now, as a student of anthropology and archaeology, he has returned to professionally explore the early inhabitants, the members of the Native American culture that once called this home here. And it's also a topic that interested Mr. Pulling. So it's nice to have a circle come about. So this is John Garbolano, and before he stands up, I want to introduce our other speaker, Daniel Cohen, who is the class of '86, and he's the Trevor Zoo Director of Media. And we are very pleased to have him speaking to us tonight because there are going to be a slideshow with lots of photos, lots of history, and he's going to present, bringing the mill that we are sitting in right now into focus for us, what its background is, and then the development of Millbrook School and the Trevor Zoo. So there's a lot of history beginning at the beginning. So, welcome, John.
For the introduction. So, John Michael Garbolano. I graduated from Millbrook High School in 2011. I then went to Elizabethtown College, where I got my Bachelor of Arts in History, Sociology, Anthropology, and Political Science. I recently graduated from the University of Albany with my Master's in Anthropology with a focus on archaeology, and I'm now continuing my education at the University of Albany to do my PhD, where I will continue to focus on anthropology with a concentration in archaeology. Before I get into the Native American component at Millbrook, I'd like to take a moment to raise awareness about the area we live in, where our homes and businesses are located on, were once are the homes of people who once lived here for thousands of years, but were forcibly removed when Dutch and European colonists came here in North America. Those were the Munsee and Mohican Native Americans. Those are the specific people who occupied Dutchess County and other areas of the Northeast. They were forcibly moved in the late 18th and 19th century and moved by foot out to Wisconsin, where they currently live on a reservation of about 23,000 acres. Today the population numbers about 1,500 people. These groups, the Mohican and Munsee, they had a large territory. They had northern reaches in Mont Tyler, Vermont, and Saratoga County. They had western reaches in northwestern Pennsylvania. They had southern reaches in western Long Island in New Jersey, and they had eastern reaches in Massachusetts and Connecticut to about the Connecticut River. That's 5 states. Today, the land from Rockland County and Westchester County, all the way up to Saratoga County and above, and Washington County are federally recognized as Mohican and Delaware Nation territories. And what's important, what's currently going on, is the continued acquisition and repatriation of land and resources of these people. It's an ongoing effort that's mediated by tribal historic preservation offices and state historic preservation offices in these various states. So now the Millbrook School Native American component. First acknowledged by Edward Pulling in 1941 through David Spencer's essay, A Brief History of the Property of Millbrook School, and then later recognized by Edward Pulling in the early years of Millbrook School, which was a small essay he wrote about the 50th anniversary, recognizing the Millbrook School's history. Starting in 1863, the Royal Colony of New York established its first 12 counties, Dutchess County being one of them. Land ownership was acquired through a series of patents granted by the English Crown to both individual proprietors and partnerships, and then divided for settlement through lease or sale. In total, some 650,000 acres were acquired during the last decades of the 17th century. The Great Nine Partners Patent, which some of you might be familiar with, there's Nine Partners Road just outside the village of New York. There's also the Nine Partners Quakers Meeting House. That occurred in 1697 and was a land grant that developed out of permission from King William III of England to then New York Governor Benjamin Fletcher to allow European colonists to begin buying land from Native Americans that once lived in Dutchess County. In total, about 145,000 acres were acquired. In 1734, this is when the current property we're on now comes into play. The Nine Partners patent was divided by surveyors in 4 tiers and 9 lots. Lot 22 contained over 3,000 acres and actually also contained the bulk of the property that we're standing on today. According to the essays by Spencer and Pulling, a clan of Wapani or Wappingers Indians, known as the Tamarack clan, was once situated in the vicinity of Millbrook. The last surviving member of this group was called Chief Tamarack and is said to live behind the old football fields, which is now the turf field, in an old clapboard shanty. He died in the early 1800s, and apparently the shanty, the home he lived in, remained standing until about 1865. Burial mounds are also said to have existed on the property. On the property that once belonged to S. Sloan Cole, whose property adjoined the schools. I'm not sure exactly where this was located, but I'm pretty sure it was located on the back end of School Road near the bend of where the marsh is. There's also the Marcy collection, which some of you might be familiar with if you've ever have gone into schoolhouse, which was found by Mr. Marcy, a farmer who lived at the bend. When you're coming down Millbrook School, there's a house on your left. He lived on that house. He lived in that house. And he had donated his private collection to Edward Pulling. And I've actually examined this collection. It contains things like beveled axes, adzes, which were used to dig up boats or cut down trees. There's also net sinkers to use to acquire fish, pestles, and at least one projectile point. But archaeologists and historians today studying native peoples of the Hudson Valley have recognized that the main nations or tribes named by European explorers actually represent two distinct Eastern Algonquin cultural linguistic groups. Those are the Munsee and Mohican people. Various dialects of Eastern Algonquin range all the way from the Northern Maritimes of Canada all the way down to North Carolina. In this area we have the Munsee speakers, which are a sub-tribe of the Lenape. The Lenape lived further south towards New York City. But the Munsee speakers themselves lived along the lower course of the Hudson River. And then you have Mohican-speaking people who lived on the upper Hudson Valley from around the Catskill watershed all the way up to the city of Albany. However, a little has been done to determine the exact location or territorial boundaries between these completely different cultural groups. The Dutchess County Wappingers, a Munsee-speaking band that lived on the east side of the Hudson River, most likely lived in the land we're on right now, which is why I'm so interested in collaborating with Drew Casartano and other faculty of the school to try and solve and resolve the important part of our area's history, the people who lived in Millbrook, potentially, where you guys all live today, if you're local. Which brings me to Indigenous collaboration. And you may ask, why is this important? It's important for not only archaeologists, but also for all of you, the public. Indigenous collaboration does several things. It acknowledges human rights of Indigenous people and their ancestors. It creates broader and richer perspectives and interpretations. Including tribal members can provide valuable input and recommendations on how to move forward on projects that might involve Native American cultural remains or resources. It also opens up communication, a dialogue, and it's a huge investment into future research. It begins to heal historical wounds. We live in a country that was founded by immigrants, but there were people who already lived here before us. There's a lot of big holes to fill in, both public awareness and in terms of archaeology itself. Archaeologists, we don't know it all, we're constantly learning, and you can never learn everything in one lifetime, that's just the way it is. But research projects, such as the one I'm proposing to Drew Casartano, can help support Indigenous communities, scholars, and contribute to critical Indigenous scholarship. What's most important, I think, is the inclusion and the impact you can have on younger Indigenous or Native American peoples. Potentially put them on a path that gets them involved in cultural resources, archaeology, forestry, government, which is really huge, because we tend to not ever acknowledge the people that once lived here, whether it's president giving a speech or local mayors or historical societies. These things are kind of just never brought to the table. So I have sat down with Drew Casartano and we've sort of drafted some early short-term and long-term plans, working with the school's existing collections, building a dialogue with tribal leaders or representatives, and then long-term, developing a plan or program that allows Millbrook students and young Mohican or Stockbridge Munsee people to actually come here and learn about the history of this area, and hopefully develop a plan to help start giving back and acknowledging the important history that isn't really talked about anymore. I myself am really excited to get working, and I hope these projects that I've discussed with Drew happen. Pretty confident they will, but it's important to be transparent, inclusive, and inviting when you move forward on a project like this that works with Indigenous people. I myself am a student at the University of Albany, and in November it's Native American Heritage Month. This isn't to badmouth my university, but myself and my professor were the only two individuals who did anything on campus that even acknowledged Native Americans. We had reached out to Indigenous people, we had people come to campus, we had people working this field, speak to the university students about the importance of this, which is what I'd like to do at a more local level in Millbrook. So if you have any questions or would like to talk after this, I'd be more than welcome to answer your questions as best as I can. but that is sort of why I'm here today. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're thrilled to have the Millbrook Historical Society here this evening. In fact, I think this is really our first event that we've had in the mill. We had a little opening last year on Alumni Weekend, but this is the real first outside group to come and use this space, and we're absolutely thrilled to do that. My name is Dan O'Cohen. As Allison told you, I graduated from Millbrook in 1986. Millbrook School was founded in 1931 by Edward Pulling. That year, the school enrolled their first 21 students. This past May, Millbrook celebrated the largest graduating class ever in the history of the school with 97 students. We call them sixth formers, and there they are, and all going off to college next year. Our headmaster, Drew Casertano, I'm sure many of you know him. He'll be starting his 29th year as headmaster this coming fall, which is basically unheard of in this day and age in the boarding school world. We're incredibly lucky to have benefited from he and Linda's vision and their dedication to this school and guided everything that's happened here since 1990. The school's founding mission, which you can see here in the original brochure, is based on 5 core values that continue to continue on today: curiosity, respect, integrity, environmental stewardship, and service. And those values are embedded in everything we do here at the school. Today our enrollment is about 310 students across 4 grades, with students representing 23 states and 17 foreign countries. Most of our 80 faculty members live on campus, and our average class size is 12. We have 8 boarding dorms, and about 85% of our students live on campus. But every one of our day students has a bed available to them if they want to spend the night. Most schools don't offer that. Our campus has grown over the years to now about 800 acres. It's 90 miles from New York City. Includes a 7-acre solar field, which powers the entire campus, all of our electrical needs. We have 38 athletic teams across 14 sports, and since 1931, as Allison mentioned, all of our students have participated in an active community service program. We now have 36 different community service groups, and these provide real responsibilities to the students, real leadership positions. Of course, my favorite community service is the Trevor Zoo. It's the only zoo located at a high school in the world. So, the mill, which you're all sitting in right now, is the oldest part of Millbrook's campus. Around 1820, a man named John Letty dammed up the stream to get water to power a sawmill, which was located just below where our otter enclosure is now located. So it was just a little bit up and a little bit on the other side of the river. 40 years later, in 1862, another fellow named William Mosher purchased an acre of land, including the dam and the area just below it, for $300. And he got permission to raise the mill dam 5 feet higher. This picture is probably from the early 30s, before the bridge to the zoo was built. And it increased the water flow with a higher dam, and there was a wooden flume that drove the water down into the basement of this building, where he built a new grist mill. The Stanford Glen Mill operated in this building until 1927, when Mr. Joseph Marcy, the last miller, decided to become a farmer. More about him later. When in operation, the mill ground grain into flour for all the farmers in the neighborhood. Water was directed into the basement, as I said, with the flume. Turning a horizontal wheel, you can see there, this is just before we did the restoration, connected directly to the millstones. That is one, this was just a few years ago. We have that stone, and we are going to place it in front of the building on a pedestal with a little display talking about it. The stones were from France. They were brought over by a sailing ship to Poughkeepsie. It took 87 days to cross the Atlantic. And then the stones were drawn on sleds by oxen up here to the Stanford Glen. By all accounts, and some early photographs that I've seen, the exterior of the building was indeed white originally. In the 1930s, it was painted red and remained that way until recently when we returned it to its original color. That's shortly before the restoration as well. So, Ed Pulling. The reason I'm here today, and everyone, I guess, is here. He was born outside of London in England in 1898, the son of an insurance man. His family moved to the United States in 1908 when the United States Congress decided that U.S. companies could no longer sell insurance overseas. So they had to move originally to Pittsburgh and then to Baltimore. He attended the Gilman School near Baltimore, then Princeton University, and in 1917 he went back to England, joined the Royal Navy during World War I. After the war, he got his first teaching job at Groton School, then under the direction of its founder, the famous Reverend Endicott Peabody. Peabody became Pulling's mentor almost immediately, and much of what he brought to Millbrook he learned and observed at Groton. Peabody's philosophy of education could be summed up in a single remark he made to Pulling on the day they first met. Quote, "Teaching is the imparting of truth through personality." The year was 1920. Pulling furthered his education at Trinity College in Cambridge, England, and then returned to Groton as the head of the history department. In 1928, he married Lucy Leffingwell, and they moved to the newly founded Avon Old Farm School in Avon, Connecticut, where Pulling headed their history department. Under Avon's founder, Theodate Pope Riddle, one of the first female architects of in the United States, and headmaster Francis Frolicker, Pulling was first exposed to the progressive movement in education. And he would meld that experience with his previous experience at Groton into his own direction of progressive conservatism, he called it, that he would bring to the founding of Millbrook School. By the time he arrived at Avon, Pulling knew he wanted to start his own school. And in fact, he'd been encouraged by many people to do so, one of whom was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then governor of New York. Pulling had taught FDR's sons while at Groton, and even tutored them in Hyde Park over holidays and breaks. When it came time for Pulling to look for property to build his school, FDR suggested some land nearby to his house in Hyde Park on Cream Street. He even offered to give Pulling access to the river through his property and build a boathouse for a crew team. As tempting as that offer was, Pulling didn't take the fact that the main road to Albany from New York was right through Hyde Park. And this is pre-Taconic Parkway. It was the main road, Route 9. So he was looking for something a little more isolated, a little more remote. And he felt that being so closely associated with FDR could possibly hurt his prospects when trying to enroll students from Republican families. Nevertheless, one of FDR's grandsons did attend Millbrook, and Eleanor was a frequent guest here and spoke many times to the school. Mrs. Pulling, Lucy, had been at a wedding many years earlier, before they were married in Millbrook, for her friend Betty Flagler, and remembered how impressed she had been with the beauty of the area. The Pullings contacted Betty and were put in touch with a real estate agent who brought them to the Stevenson farm. Upon seeing the property, Ed Pulling knew at once he had found the spot for his new school. It had everything he was looking for: approximately 200 acres of farmland, well away from a main road, but close enough to a pleasant village and a railroad station, a pond and streams and farm buildings, including a huge barn, with woods and plenty of flat land for playing fields. And somewhat importantly, it was not very close to a golf course, a favorite hobby of Mr. Pulling, and something he knew would take too much of his time if he was tempted to hit the links every day. Instead, he and Lucy often rode their horses on the campus as a respite from their work. Betty Flagler was one of 3 daughters of Henry Harkness Flagler and his wife Anne. Mr. Flagler was the son of the famous Henry M. Flagler, the American industrialist, founder of Standard Oil, as well as the developer of the Atlantic coast of Florida and the railway there. Fortunately for Millbrook and the Pullings, Henry Harkness Flagler was more interested in education and music than he was in railroads and oil like his father. Flagler was the president of the Philharmonic Symphony Society of New York, was Millbrook's first board president when the school was incorporated in 1932, and he remained the head of the board until his death in June of 1952. Probably no one was more generous in the development of the school in those years and the growth of the campus. The Flagler Memorial Chapel, dedicated to his wife Anne, and designed by the school's architect Edward Shepard Hewitt, was his crowning gift, and completion of the school's western campus, which we now call the Flagler Quad. In the school's library hangs a portrait of Mr. Flagler. Below his portrait reads the inscription, "Si monumentum requires circumspice," which translates, if you need a monument to this person, just look around. Stepping back to the 30s, when Ed Pulling arrived on the property, he was presented with the Stevenson Farm, a former dairy farm with a barn, a farmhouse, stables, a log cabin, and of course, the mill. Ownership of the land on which the school now stands traded hands many times during the 18th century, but in 1806, it became a dairy farm. The farm continued in operation until the death of its last owner, George Stevenson Sr., in 1926. His heirs sold the property in 1928 to Frederick H. Bonteque. As master of the Millbrook Hunt, Mr. Bonteque's intentions were to make the land the center of the Hunt Club. He already had another farm, which we now know as Raleigh Farm, which Mr. Bonteque liked better than this property. But the oncoming Great Depression and stock market crash of 1929 changed his plans for the hunting club, and he was happy to sell the property to Mr. Pulling. Mr. Bonteque became one of Millbrook's great benefactors, and Fred and his wife, Cornelia, became great friends with Ed and Lucy Pulling. Not only did they send their sons Fred Jr., class of 41, and Jesse, class of 44, to Millbrook, but Fred Sr. became the head of the board after the death of Mr. Flagler in 1952. Jesse Bonteque arrived at Millbrook 2 days after the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. At least that's what he told me, even though his yearbook page says he entered in 1937. So he might have repeated a year. He remembers that because he said he spent his first days on campus picking up sticks from the hurricane on the lawn of the headmaster's house. Back then the school was 7th through 12th grade. As we call them, first formers through sixth formers, a British tradition instilled by Mr. Pulling and continued today. The school had 6 grades until about the 50s when it became just 9th through 12th grade as it is now. Mr. Pulling, there's hockey, of course, huge with the Bonteques, and if you've ever been in our current rink, it's of course the Bonteque rink, and our old rink, the parking lot where you parked today was the Bonteque rink, and there's Jesse number 3. They were undefeated for years. Mr. Pulling purchased the 220-acre property in November of 1930 for $130,000. And another $70,000 more was spent for buildings and renovations before the school opened the following year. Again, from the original brochure, the original trustees, including Mr. Flagler, Endicott Peabody. The bulk of the funding for buying and upgrading the property came from Mr. Pulling's father-in-law, Mr. Russell Leffingwell. That's him on the lower right there. A New York banker, he joined J.P. Morgan in 1923 and retired as chairman of the company in 1950. The Leffingwell's generosity to Millbrook continued throughout their lives and resulted in many of the buildings on campus. In 1931, the farmhouse became the headmaster's house, as it still is today. The barn became classrooms as the old cow stalls downstairs were repurposed. Theater and gym housed upstairs in the former hayloft. And a new dorm was built, then known as South Dorm, now known as Harris Hall. to house those first 21 first form boys. They are swimming, I think, on what is now the zoo pond. It's hard to tell, but I'm pretty sure that's where they are. Initial tuition cost was $1,500, which included everything except laundry. That would amount to about $23,000 in today's money. I can tell you that the tuition is significantly higher than that now, and laundry is still not included. Pulling founded Millbrook on the idea of community service. Every boy would make a significant contribution to the life of the school. It was especially true in those early years when the staff was small. They only had 2 paid people outside of the few faculty members, Fritz, the maintenance man, and George Telfler, the school's driver. The students did everything in those days. They tended the furnaces. They cleaned the pond and made ice for the hockey rink. They cleaned the buildings. And during World War II, they did even more, as most able-bodied men went off to war. That's Mr. Pulling there with the hat, overseeing the farm. Oops, sorry. By the time the Pullings arrived, the grist mill flume was still here, but it was in such bad shape that they had to tear it down. The mill machinery was still in this building as well, but it was removed to provide space for a furnace to heat the building, which was to become a carpentry shop on the first floor. Fred Blaustein, a local cabinet maker, taught carpentry in the mill in the 30s and 40s. And upstairs in this space we're now sitting in was an art studio and a classroom. Artists Grant Renard and Waldemar Neufeld taught classes here. Waldemar's son Larry graduated from Millbrook in 1967. An accomplished builder, he worked on many of the projects at the school over the years, including the Trevor Zoo's education building. Of course, the story of the Trevor Zoo is one that would require an evening unto itself, but I'll give you a few highlights. In fact, I'll let Mr.
My wife and I were having a nice cozy dinner shortly after commencement when a dilapidated old station wagon drew up at the front door. This young man said, "Sir, is it true that you're looking for a science teacher?" I said, "Yes, it is. What are your qualifications?" When he came into the study and never stopped pouring out his abilities, his capabilities, and what he wanted to do and so on for half an hour. And I was simply overwhelmed. But I had a perfectly clear-cut hunch that he was the man I wanted. Then I said to Frank Trevor, that was the name of this extraordinary young man, "Would you please tell me what further you got in those crates in that dilapidated old station wagon?" He said, "They used to be my animals. Tonight they've become the Millbrook Zoo."
Over the subsequent years, the zoo grew along with the school, and Frank Trevor touched the lives and changed the worldview of many Millbrook boys. Mr. Trevor retired a few years after Edward Pulling, who retired in 1965 after 34 years of service to the school. In 1974, John O'Meggs from the class of 1965 returned to Millbrook and began a 40-year career of transforming the Trevor Zoo into the nationally recognized institution it is today. In 1989, the zoo received its first national AZA accreditation, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. We now house and breed 9 endangered species and some 180 animals across 80 different species. We welcome more than 30,000 visitors each year, many of them school children visiting their first zoo and seeing exotic animals like lemurs and red pandas for the first time. During the school year, more than 80 Millbrook students work at the zoo every day, feeding, cleaning, and caring for the animals. It's a unique life lesson being responsible for other living things that no other high school students can experience in this way. Only at Millbrook, we like to say. After the Holbrook Art Center was opened on campus in 2001, the mill sat mostly unused for many years and was slowly falling apart. Bats and birds inhabited this space upstairs. The siding was rotting away. Slowly, the mill was becoming an eyesore, one which greeted visitors to campus when they first arrived down School Road. You can imagine Drew's consternation about that. Before John Meggs retired a few years ago, one of his last efforts was to save this building and repurpose it as an entrance to the Trevor Zoo along with a gift shop. After all, it was already on the zoo side of the street. Sounds simple, but it was not. It was a battle. There were some on the board who thought it was a waste of time. The school had bigger priorities, and perhaps it would be better to knock down the old mill and be done with it, rather than trying to save a 150-year-old building. But as you can see, clearer heads prevailed, and the mill was indeed saved. Thanks to the generosity of many, funds were raised and the building was restored. All the beams and floorboards are original, and the footprint remains as it was. New walls and windows were installed with modern spray foam insulation, making the building quite warm in the winter and nicely cool in the summer. We burn no fossil fuels. It's all solar-powered electricity and very, very efficient. The design and renovation was masterfully done by my friend and classmate, John Ali, from the class of '86. John's firm, Ali Architecture and Design, is located in Millerton. The budget was just under $500,000, and construction took about 18 months to complete. To say we're thrilled with the results would really be an understatement. As is the case with this building, the zoo is often the beneficiary of its neighbors. Many in the Millbrook community aren't directly associated with the life of the school. While Millbrook remains a private institution, the Trevor Zoo is in fact a public space, although it is owned and operated by the school. Frankly, without the support and generosity of our neighbors and friends, we wouldn't be able to accomplish all that we do at the zoo, and we wouldn't be able to continue to grow and evolve. Mr. Pulling knew the value of his neighbors, and one of his challenges in the early years was how to keep on good terms with them, with the prospect of young teenage boys running through the countryside over their fields. In the fall of 1938, Mr. Pulling received a phone call one evening from his immediate neighbor to the south, who lived in that house, Farmer Joseph Marcy. "Mr. Pulling," he said, "one of your boys has been sliding off my hayrick and causing havoc. I won't stand for it." After apologizing as well as he could on the phone, Mr. Pulling headed over to the dining hall to explain to the boys what had happened. He asked the culprit to step forward so he could bring him down to Mr. Marcy's house to apologize in person. To Mr. Pulling's relief, the guilty party stepped forward. It was none other than Jesse Barbecue. Off they went to Mr. Marcy's house, with Mr. Pulling waiting outside in the car while the farmer berated young Jay for about 10 minutes. Finally, Mrs. Marcy stepped in, said that was enough, offered Jesse some cider and cookies. Mr. Marcy came out to speak to Mr. Pulling. "Let's go down to the cellar," he said. "I have some homemade wine I'd like you to sample." Thus begun a wonderful friendship between the country farmer and the Cambridge-educated educator. Before becoming a farmer, Mr. Marcy had run the Stanford grist mill. He often came up to campus to spin yarns to the boys about the olden days. His schooling never went past the 6th grade, but he was a poet at heart. On one visit to campus, he presented Mr. Pulling with the following poem, which he had scrawled on an old Stanford Glen Mill letterhead. Quote, "For such precious things as these, friendly fields and fruitful years, footsteps turning in the lane to the old mill again, words that welcome home may know, sun and song and swelling seed, sure supply for every need for the days that come and go. We thank thee so, O Lord, for the smoke from chimney afar, for the rainbow and the stars, for the busy hands that build the old mill, for each home flower did make such precious things as these, for each God-aspiring man, for the simple joys of living. Lord, we lift our hand in glad thanksgiving thoughts to the old mill and miller, with candlestick in hand alight to roam across the trails of memory by the old mill stream." Thank you.
for either speaker.
I've got one here.
Okay, yes.
Have you found, as an archaeologist, have you found any Native American implements or anything here on campus?
I have not on the campus itself, but I have viewed the Marcy collection myself, and I've made my own interpretation of what the objects are that Mr. Marcy donated.
And where did he get them?
In this field, I mean, he dug them up in the field.
In the plow. So
Oh,
typically, that's actually how a lot of sites are found. When farmers go beneath the plow zone,
Makes
it's anywhere from a foot to 2 feet deep, depending on how deep the plow teeth are. And that's usually how things get turned up. It's actually how we find a lot of paleo Indian sites. But yeah.
And his house was, as Dan was just reading the poem, Mr. Marcy's house was the one that's right down Millbrook School Road.
Right at the turn there. Elaine Lifter, who's our head of the theater now, and the theater program, she lives in that house there today. It's just after the marsh, right where the road turns.
on the left-hand side as you're
Yeah.
going out to 44?
They're going on.
No,
Yeah,
when you're
when you're coming
On the
in,
right.
when you're
Oh,
coming in
that-
here, it's on the
that
left.
one.
When you're,
Okay.
yep. Any other questions?
Thoughts? Maybe you could tell us the story, just a part of the renovation, the wood on the
The back.
platform, the deck.
Yeah, so this is Alan Tusciano is our director now. Alan has been here, he's been here twice. So he came when I was a student in 1985, was our intern, then went, after a few years of being here, working with Jono, went off, got his PhD in biology at the University of Texas in Austin, and came back and has been back here since the early 90s. He's now the director of the zoo, and has really developed a wonderful friendship with a former alum who was a country vet, Julian Strauss, who lives over in Mena. And Julian went to Millbrook, graduated I think in 52, 4, somewhere in there. You can buy his maple syrup downstairs. And Julian happens to have a large bandsaw, which Alan saw as a great advantage when they wanted to cut some wood for the deck that's underneath us right here. And the same wood is also on the desk downstairs. So there was a slippery elm tree right across the way. You can still see the stump of it. And it had died, but it had to be torn down. So they cut it down, and Alan cut it up in pieces, took it over to Julian's, they milled it, and now everybody who comes into the zoo walks on that wood. So it's a great story and a great way to. Alan does not let a tree hit the ground without having some purpose for it, whether it's perching for animals in the zoo or building something that we can make use of. So.
I have a question. I'm noticing that there's a lot of peg joinery. Is
Yeah.
this all done with peg joinery?
Yeah, I don't think there was a nail in this building originally. And actually, in those days, you know, in 1862, it would have made a lot more sense to use pegs than metal. So. Sure.
You may have said this, but I missed it. How did Mr. Trevor happen to come to Millbrook? I mean, why?
Well, he gone to Cornell and had studied biology. And I don't know how people found out in those days, but there was an opening for a biology teacher. And which was pretty amazing that in 1936, high school was looking for a biology teacher. I didn't know they taught biology that long ago, but he somehow found out. And as Mr. Pulling said, the evening after commencement that year, pulled up on campus right in front of the headmaster's house in a station wagon with his animals in tow. And Mr. Pulling said it was the best 30-minute decision he ever made in his life.
That's amazing.
Well, I guess we should break and have more refreshments downstairs. But thank you to both of you.